In the Darkness I See by Anon Prologue. The most gloriously bright and bountiful day blessed Sarasota and all its inhabitants. In a seemingly tranquil room, Mark Kozlov sat turbulently, his aching back forming a solidified hunch. Filthy, drunk, and dazed, he typed away at his work of art. Mark had been finalizing his story for months, fastidiously rediscovering and then meticulously describing the events that had led to the isolation of his heart from his mind and his mind from its normalcy. Through the process of building his book, powered by pixels, Mark had finally regained his conscious grasp on the world, writing his life. What he had done and who he had been had all come back to him in the most unrelenting manner, his perversions percolating beneath each word. It was the final fragment of his process, the moment of his reckoning. With his heavy heart pounding and tired fingers dancing, Mark sat, primed for his binding admission. After retyping and destroying many iterations of the last sentence, taking hours to reach one moment, he stagnantly sat on, the words rising from the abyss. He waited for hours atop his piquant perch, furious at his stalled finalization. After much debilitating deliberation, in a stroke of supreme poignancy and mad genius, Mark filled in the sentence. In that stinking room, hot from the cracked windows, he typed the final utterance of his former self. As the strike of his finger landed on the ultimate key, with monumental might, he collapsed from the weight of his lengthy repentance, banging his forehead down onto the desk. With Mark's tears ripping their way through him and into the dim light of his room, he breathed heavily. Using a sorrowful voice, and with a fervent screech, Mark cried, "Gone!" The computer screen glowed at him with radiant beauty. Mark was a broken man who had once been of immense consequence. Though he had known wealth and greatness, he now resided in the most contemptible solace. Lost for days on end in thought, imprisoned within discordant reminiscences. Mark's room was firmly cluttered, fully acquainted with his newly disordered life. Only in memory could he uncover the luxuriously decadent escape it had once been. With all its palatial pride eroded, soured into pestilential poverty, his room stood reminiscent of abject hopelessness. From the abundant beauty of his past, he had finally refined his room into the cell he felt he deserved, his objectified oblivion. Across each wall there were paintings. They were all depictions of the same scene. The singular image had captivated his mind. From watercolor to sketch, they all ate at Mark, possessing him. It was that image that drove him wild, stripping him of his sanity. That bright and troubled scene, so perfectly abstract and oozing with intense unease, grasped him tightly. Skew and dusty, the frenzied frames all hung in disorderly despair. Exactness was lost on each of them, except for one rendition. Closest to the pained victim, the smallest and most potent oil painting had nested above his desk. Though the oil gleamed brilliantly with its shimmering luster, Mark's darkness imbued the bright colors with a cold senselessness. Mark had spent much of his recent torturous time, whenever not engrossed in remembrance, cleaning the simple desk where his focus resided. He had no time for any other order. On the desk, thoroughly cleaned by him, everything but one journal and a note remained. One simple note card with 5 lines written haphazardly across its surface stayed on. Rough and faded, from reworking, the note card lived, neatly nestled beneath him, always there to remind him of something. With the midday sun creeping languidly through the closed blinds and peeping through Mark's beguiling and cavernous dwelling, the room remained dull and gloomy. His grand bed stood with great impropriety, its duvet sequestered into a clumsy corner and pillows strewn about. Across from his brooding bed stood his collection of works as an active psychologist, with all the captured knowledge antiquated and tattered within old folders and binders. An assortment of emptied bottles, wedged between the sides of the shelf and the varied writings, tightly held each row upright. A single candle holder burned dimly in the busy corner, and, from his father, a 5-foot candle holder stood tall beneath it. The thin holder reached up like a needle and delicately held the remnants of a large candle upon its wide, circular top. The candle was small in comparison to the paternal pillar. Its burning wick had melted and disfigured it. From its ornate, shapely origins, the waxy abstraction that remained was an insult to the candle's former glory. Barely standing, the mostly tall candle, unsteadily balanced, distorted by its own weight, the liquid wax within the candle begged for release, tunneling downwards narrowly along one side. Mark loved it. It was all that he had left. That grotesquely misshapen reminder of his former pride burned on. From its tower, the candle calmly danced, its feeble wick burning tenuously above its pool of melted wax. Filling the room with the warm sadness of yellow light, it remained there. The unceremonious room screamed in silence at Mark with each passing moment. He awaited the room's digestion of him, terrorized. Suddenly, a soft pop rang out from nowhere traceable, agitating Mark. It was the most minute knock. In his head, though, the sound boldly burst through the room and into his mind. He anxiously whispered, "Just a mouse, I suppose, gathering scraps for the coming winter. It will be a glorious winter this year. The crisp air awaits. No, it's someone else. Is it him? Of course not. I remain here, alone, in my wakeful delusion. Within infinitum purgatorium I reside." A long silence filled the air, Mark's forgetfulness eventually ailing his pounding heart and quelling his troubled focus. For the imprecision of his immediate memory, Mark was unknowingly thankful. Scratching furiously at an itch he had developed across his stomach, he ripped away at the scarred arena of his strife, peeling layers of skin away with his overgrown nails. After the pleasurable pain had washed through him, Mark sighed inharmoniously. A sharp, painful cough followed close behind. Mark then slowly returned to his ruminations, paying special attention to the restated quiet. Just as some semblance of tranquility began touching at Mark's heart, another abrupt interruption rattled him out of his regressed to trance. With the stillness shattered once again, Mark stood and powerfully turned to the door behind him. The knock continued, growing slowly from faint to frightful in a great and manifold moment upwards, an infinitesimal increase towards sonorous maleficence. The pop-like knocking persisted, on and off, louder each time. After some dazed pacing, the sound finally overwhelmed Mark. With the pain of a son's wrath surging through his cerebellum, he lifted his hands to his ears. With hands bound to his head, cupped against either ear, he toiled in misery, falling to the floor and curling into a fetal position. The booming snaps and pops from all around the room echoed with clear resonance, creeping in through the gaps in Mark's hands and bellowing their cruel call. The cacophonous torment echoed thunderously between his hands and eardrums, with the bursts of sound like muffled gunshots within his brain. Mark cumbersomely rose from the floor and leapt across the room, reaching for the candle. As Mark's hand parted from the right side of his head, the terror rushed back into his ear with great ease, slamming him into further disarray. He crumbled to the floor once again. As the thud of Mark's body reverberated throughout the room, the sinister symphony ceased. A worried smile drooped down from his face. With his left hand pressed against his head and his right ear welded to a floorboard, Mark slowly reached for the stem of the candle holder and slid his head across the floor to just beneath it. Once there, Mark's hand stumbled across the edge of the eminent holder. As soon as he felt the familiar cold sting of steel against his wrist, Mark struck the holder's base, hoping to knock the candle off its throne. With the candle's final flame extinguished by the tempestuous waves of wax, a defeated cry boomed violently from Mark's lips. One more strike proved fruitful. Remaining on the pedestal, the candle's weak and wax-laden edge broke. The pooled wax, vicious and viscous, emitted from the ruptured candle, created a blob of thick wax as it departed from the edge of the holder. The plummeting pearl hurled downward, summoned by Mark's mewling. Seeing the blob and beaming with delight, Mark removed his hand from the side of his head and opened his ear to the onslaught. The first gush of wax slammed into his cheek, scorching it red. The remaining wax, descending with the lascivious urgency of sadistic destruction, flowed in a skinny stream downwards from the lip of its proud post. The flowing wax formed a perfect needle, a terrible blade to vanquish the sound that drove Mark insane. Howling in pain, Mark shifted his ear closer to the waxy rill that remained, placing it directly under the onslaught from above. The wax filled his ear with seething pain, the worst in him engorging itself on the fatty wax's effects. Mark's remaining sanity compelled a sharp whimper to limp out from his lips. Though overrun with pain, Mark remained steady underneath the cascading torture, his purposeful pursuit of peace immobilizing him. His eyes were bloodshot, wide, and bursting from their sockets with agony. With no blinks to blur his fixation, Mark stared directly at his prized painting, that oily scene. With the wax coursing through Mark's inner ear and arriving at the inception point of sound perception itself, the ear fell into deafness. The expulsion of the candle's wax ceased, and the shifted density of the distorted candle caused it to tip over, off the ornament. The dampened thwack against the hard wood shocked Mark halfway to death. Closing his eyes, with all the shadowy reminders of his mundane obscurity engulfing him, Mark cried. He had finally completed his triumphantly miserable memoir. The book irradiated the room from its inglorious laptop screen housing as Mark's heart beat its last inglorious thumps. While death finally infiltrated his presence, his only thought was so clean and simple. His story shone through him. Mark's redemption, addition, and truth were all in that book. The light dimly glowed from behind his eyelids at first, and then nothingness extinguished it. Moments later, the light interrupted his wakeful rest. He groaned at the screen. All he wanted was for that night to take him. He only hoped for his drunken suicide's closure. The same fate as his father's cursed him. He could feel it coming on. The cowardice of a probabilistic death was about to stain the family name for the last time. Though it was coming soon to him, he was to feel all those lost moments fully. After the timeless agony had stripped the remaining sanity from his convictions, Mark entered his closing. Knowing it was almost over, Mark's wide eyes glinted joyfully. He took great solace in the shallow and desperate breaths of his ending life. With the puffs and pools of his inebriated annihilation shrinking, Mark delved further into nothingness. His endmost exhale almost revealed his uninvited guest's name. The partial words of a dying man dripped into existence. Half sounds bled out. Just. The final pain stroke of Mark's stained heart beat its last cantankerous beat. A deep exhale bellowed out from within him, the warm humidity of his breath radiating through the dark room. There was almost nothing left in that room but darkness. With Mark's transformation complete and his destination final, he rested. All there was, aside from the darkness, was his immortalized story. The final words of Mark's book glared especially bright. Into the darkness, unseen by him now, the story shone. Still there, always there, haunting his corpse and bound to him, the story remained. Mark was gone at last. This concludes the prologue to In the Darkness I See by Anon Y.